long before there were borders or capitals, before the division of North and South, before the very idea of Korea. There were people who hunted beneath the shadow of ancient pines, who shaped stone into tools, who traced the rivers that flowed across the peninsula. Archaeologists have uncovered stone blades, pottery, and traces of fire pits in caves near the Taedong River, which flows through what would one day become Pyongyang. These fragments whisper that human life here stretched back tens of thousands of years, when the land was colder, harsher, yet still sustaining. As the last ice age softened, forests of oak and chestnut spread, and with them came villages. Farmers began to coax millet and rice from the soil. Their settlements marked by round pit houses, half buried in the earth to shield from winter winds. In these early communities, ancestors were honored, shamans invoked spirits, and the rhythms of the seasons shaped life. Imagine the quiet of those nights, the crackle of wood fires, the low hum of chants beneath a star-filled sky. But in every culture, myth is as important as fact. And so, the people of this land told a story. A story not of stone and millet, but of heaven and destiny. They spoke of Daegon Wangim, the mythical founder of the first Korean kingdom, Gajoshin. His tale begins high above the mortal world, where the heavenly prince, Wanong, gazed down upon earth. With a retinue of ministers of wind, rain, and clouds, he descended onto Mount Taebaek, bringing order and law to humankind. It was here that a tiger and a bear came to Wanong, yearning to become human. The prince instructed them to stay in a cave, eating nothing but garlic and mugwort for 100 days. The tiger, impatient, fled the darkness. The bear endured. After 21 days, she emerged, transformed into a woman. Wanong took her as his bride, and their son, Daegon, founded Gajoshin around the year 2333 BCE, according to legend. Though mythical, the story anchored a sense of divine origin and unity, whispered for centuries across generations. The myth itself carried symbolism, the bear representing patience, earth, and maternal strength, the tiger symbolizing ferocity and wild independence. The bear was chosen, the myth seemed to say, because the Korean people would endure rather than rush. Even today, in both North and South, the story of Daegon remains a foundation taught to children, etched into monuments, invoked as a reminder of shared ancestry. But myths are only one layer of the past. Beneath them lies archaeology, fragments that give flesh to story. By the first millennium BCE, bronze daggers had begun to spread across the Korean peninsula, their unique shape distinct from those of neighboring China. These mandolin-shaped daggers have been found in northern regions, buried alongside beads of jade and ritual vessels. They tell of a society growing stratified, where chiefs ruled, warriors defended, and rituals bound communities together. The center of this early power, tradition holds, was in the north near the basin of the Taedong River, where fertile plains met mountain fortresses. Archaeologists believe that the first real state, Gajosium, likely grew here, nourished by trade with China's northeastern kingdoms. Ancient Chinese texts make mention of a land called Hosin, whose people wore distinctive clothing, live in walled towns, and valued bronze weapons. Though often seen through the eyes of outsiders, these accounts suggest that by the 4th century BCE, a northern Korean state was already strong enough to command attention. Close your eyes. Imagine walking into such a settlement. Clay walls rising high, a wooden gate creaking. Inside, homes clustered, smoke drifting upward. Traders speaking in low voices, bartering grain for tools, hides for ornaments. At the center, perhaps, a shrine where ancestors were honored with bowls of rice, wine, and incense. The air filled with the sound of drums used to summon spirits, to celebrate harvests, to mourn the departed. And warriors poised against threats, positioned between China's great dynasties and the nomadic tribes of Manchuria. The northern Koreans absorbed influences, yet also held their own. Iron technology eventually arrived, spreading first through the north, strengthening armies, giving rise to larger kingdoms. It is here, in the northern lands, that the seeds of later powerful states were planted. Yet, beyond weapons and walled towns, there was culture. The whisper of songs, the carving of patterns into pottery, the belief that mountains were sacred, living beings. The North, in particular, developed a deep reverence for mountains, seeing them as places where heaven touched earth. The myth of Dangan's descent onto a sacred peak echoes this devotion. Even today, Mount Paektu, straddling the border of North Korea and China, is regarded as holy, the very birthplace of the Korean spirit. The people lived in cycles of endurance, winters testing their stores of grain, summers demanding toil in the fields. Yet, through hardship, they carved identity. Early burial mounds reveal care for the dead, goods placed to accompany them. Stone dolmens, heavy upon the earth, silent markers of belief. These dolmens, scattered across Korea, remain among the largest collections in the world, each one a quiet voice from the Bronze Age, standing still through millennia. As the centuries rolled forward, Gajoshin grew stronger, its capital shifting, its rulers becoming more defined. By the 3rd century BCE, the kingdom was known in Chinese records as a formidable presence, ruled by kings with the title Wang. Conflicts with Chinese states began to flare, evidence that this northern kingdom was no isolated village, but a true regional power. And so, from myth and stone, from caves and river valleys, the story of northern Korea took root. A land both harsh and fertile, both mystical and practical. A land that would endure countless invasions, dynasties, and divisions. Yet, never lose the hum of its identity, carried like a soft chant through time. By the late 3rd century BCE, Gajoshin found itself facing the powerful Yan state of China, which sought to expand into Manchuria. Wars erupted, fortresses fell, and though Gajoshin resisted fiercely, the kingdom's stability weakened. The strain of constant warfare, combined with struggles among rival chiefs, caused cracks in its foundation. In 108 BCE, the mighty Han dynasty of China swept into the peninsula, conquering the Gajoshin capital near today's Pyongyang. The Han did not merely destroy, they built. They established for commanderies, military, administrative outposts in northern Korea, with the most important being Lilang Commandery, centered in Pyongyang. For nearly 4 centuries, this colony brought new waves of Chinese culture, Confucian texts, advanced iron tools, silk garments, and bureaucratic systems. Trade flourished, literacy spread, and yet resentment simmered. The local people, proud and independent, did not simply vanish under foreign rule. Instead, new kingdoms began to emerge in the northern lands, shaping the next chapter of history. Far to the north, in the cold valleys of Manchuria, a kingdom called Biao rose. Biao is little remembered today, but in its time, it was vital. Its people were semi-nomadic, skilled in horse riding. Yet, they also farmed the fields. Their culture blended steppe traditions with settled agriculture, making them both warriors and herders. Chinese records describe their customs. When someone died, mourners would wail, then sing, then feast, as though life and death were cycles, not endings. They valued cattle highly, and their warriors carried bows with precision. Biao provided both refuge and foundation, a stepping stone for what would become one of Korea's greatest kingdoms. From Biao, a new force emerged, Goguryeo, around the 1st century BCE in the rugged mountains and river valleys near the Yalu and Tumen rivers. Clans united under a leader named Jumong. His story, like that of Dung Yun, is half myth, half memory. According to legend, Jumong was the son of a celestial being and was born from an egg. Gifted in archery, his name meant skilled archer. Persecuted by rivals, he fled southward, gathering followers, and founded Goguryeo in 37 BCE. Unlike the plains kingdoms, Goguryeo grew in a harsh environment of steep mountains and rushing rivers. Its people became fierce, resilient, accustomed to defending fortresses perched on cliffs. They built massive stone ramparts, carved from mountain rock, encircling their capitals. Even today, remnants of Goguryeo fortresses stand like ancient sentinels, moss-covered and silent, in the forests of North Korea and Manchuria. The Goguryeo people worshipped heaven, mountains, and ancestors. They painted tombs with vivid murals, hunters on horseback, dancers in flowing robes, celestial creatures soaring in bright color. These murals, preserved in stone chambers beneath earthen mounds, give us a rare window into their lives. One can almost hear the laughter of feasts, the pounding of drums, the clatter of horse hooves as warriors raced across the steppe. In its early centuries, Goguryeo remained small, pressed by the Han commanderies to the south and nomadic tribes to the north. But the spirit of its people was unyielding. Slowly, through raids and alliances, Goguryeo grew stronger. By the 3rd century CE, under kings like Dongyin and Michon, it expanded rapidly, absorbing neighboring lands, driving back the weakening Han colonies. Lilang, the once dominant Chinese outpost in Pyongyang, fell to Goguryeo in 313 CE. The foreign presence that had lasted 400 years was finally erased. With Lilang gone, Goguryeo declared itself master of northern Korea. Its capital moved to Pyongyang, establishing the city as a center of power that would remain important for centuries to come. Pyongyang, with its broad river and fertile plains, became a hub of trade, culture, and politics. Palaces rose, markets bustled, scholars debated Confucian classics, while shamans still whispered prayers to mountain spirits. But Goguryeo was not alone. To the south, other kingdoms thrived. Baekje, in the southwest, and Silla, in the southeast, formed with their own unique identities. These three kingdoms, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, would shape Korean history for centuries, in rivalry and alliance, in war and culture. Yet among them, Goguryeo stood as the northern giant, a kingdom of stone fortresses, iron armor, and indomitable pride. What made Goguryeo remarkable was not only its military might, but its culture. Its warriors rode horses clad in lamel armor, charging with lances and swords. Its scholars imported Buddhism, which arrived from China in the 4th century, blending with native shamanism. Temples were built, monks chanted sutras, and yet rituals to mountain deities remained just as vital. This coexistence of faiths gave Goguryeo a spiritual depth, a balance between heaven, earth, and humankind. Buddhism, in particular, left its mark. In 372 CE, King Soserim officially adopted it as state religion, building temples in Pyongyang and welcoming monks. The teachings of compassion and discipline fit well with a warrior society, offering both solace and structure. Murals of Buddhist bodhisattvas appeared in tombs, their calm faces radiating serenity amid depictions of daily life. Imagine entering such a tomb by torchlight, walls alive with galloping horses. Flying birds, celestial guardians, and serene Buddhas painted in reds, blues, and whites that still survive after 1,600 years. Yet Goguryeo's true strength lay in its geography. Protected by mountains, it was difficult to invade, and its people were hardened by winters and rugged terrain. Chinese dynasties, from Han to Wei to Sui, launched great campaigns to subdue it. But time and again, Goguryeo resisted. The most famous of these clashes came later, in the 7th century, when the mighty Sui dynasty of China sent armies said to number over 1 million. Goguryeo's general Yulji Mundiak lured them deep into the mountains, cutting off supplies, ambushing them by rivers, until the vast Sui forces collapsed in retreat. The defeat was so catastrophic that it contributed to the Sui dynasty's fall. Such was the power of Goguryeo that it could topple an empire by endurance and cunning. Still, centuries of war also drained the kingdom. By the 7th century, Goguryeo's strength faltered. In 668 CE, allied forces of China's Tang dynasty and the southern kingdom of Silla struck a fatal blow. Goguryeo fell, its proud fortresses breached, its people scattered. Yet even in defeat, its legacy endured. The culture, fortifications, and spirit of Goguryeo left deep imprints, especially in the north. The fall of Goguryeo left a silence across the northern mountains. Fortresses that once rang with drums and banners now stood abandoned, vines crawling over their stones. But silence never lasts long in history. Out of the ruins, a new kingdom emerged, a kingdom called Balhae. In 698 CE, a Goguryeo general named Dai Zhouyang, of both Goguryeo and Mohe tribal heritage, leading them north into Manchuria's wild expanses. There, amid rivers and forests, he founded Balhae. To its people, Balhae was a rebirth of Goguryeo, carrying forward its legacy of resilience. To the Chinese Tang dynasty, however, it was a frontier state to be monitored, a mixture of northern tribes and Goguryeo exiles. Its capital was first near modern Jilin, later moved closer to the Sea of Japan. A city called Sangyanga, grand urban center with wide streets, palace walls, and markets alive with goods from all corners of Asia. Balhae was known to the Japanese as the prosperous country of the East. Its ships sailed the seas, trading furs, ginseng, horses, and fine sable pelts with Japan and China. Unlike Goguryeo stone fortresses, Balhae's art was more delicate, influenced by Tang aesthetics. Archaeologists have uncovered jade ornaments, gilt bronze crowns, and painted ceramics from its tombs, each piece whispering of a cultured, cosmopolitan society. Yet, despite elegance, Balhae's people remained hardy, living in lands of long winters and vast forests. They were hunters, horsemen, farmers of millet and barley, and they carried the spirit of both steppe and settled life. Balhae also absorbed Buddhism deeply. Temples rose, bells tolled across valleys, and monks traveled between Balhae and Tang, China, exchanging scriptures and teachings. Still, animist traditions lingered. Shamans invoked mountain spirits and river gods, offering sacrifices under the night sky. Thus, Balhae, like Goguryeo before it, balanced heaven and earth, faith and pragmatism. Yet Balhae's geography, vast and scattered, made unity fragile. Its population was diverse descendants of Goguryeo, Mohe tribes, even Chinese settlers. Ruling such a mixture required delicate governance, and though Balhae kings claimed equality with Tang emperors, their grip was never absolute. By the 10th century, new powers pressed in. To the north and west, the Khitan, a nomadic people of the steppe, expanded rapidly, forming the Liao dynasty. In 926 CE, the Khitan armies swept into Balhae's heart, shattering the kingdom. Balhae's royal family and many nobles fled south, seeking refuge in the Korean peninsula. Others remained under Khitan rule, absorbed into the Liao order. The memory of Balhae lingered as a dream of northern pride. But its lands fell silent, its cities reduced to ruins beneath forest and snow. Today, in far northeastern China and Russia's Primorsky Krai, remnants of Balhae's cities remain stone foundations, broken pagodas, fragments of pottery, silent yet powerful reminders of a forgotten kingdom that once bridged Korea, China, and Siberia. While Balhae rose and fell, the southern kingdom of Silla had unified much of the Korean peninsula. Beginning in 668 CE, known as the Unified Silla period, it controlled the south and center, but its grasp on the north remained uncertain. The rugged mountains and steppes of Manchuria were beyond its easy reach. The people of those northern lands, the Khitan, and remnants of Balhae's population retained independence. shaping a different identity from the southern peninsula. By the 9th century, unified Silla weakened. Internal aristocratic struggles, peasant revolts, and pressure from neighboring states fractured its unity. In the vacuum, new dynasties emerged. In 918 CE, General Wang Jian founded the Goryeo dynasty, unifying the peninsula once again under a name that would later give rise to the modern word Korea. Was centered in the south and middle, yet it never forgot the north. Its kings claimed descent from Goguryeo and aspired to reclaim its legacy. They called their realm successor to Goguryeo, seeking legitimacy not just from unifying the peninsula, but also from tying themselves to northern pride. However, northern territories remained contested, with Khitan and later Jurchen tribes holding sway. The Khitan, who had destroyed Balhae, grew into a formidable empire. In the 10th and 11th centuries, they launched repeated invasions into Goryeo, crossing frozen rivers and mountain passes. Yet, the Koreans resisted. At the Battle of Gwiju in 1019, General Gangamchan of Goryeo used cunning strategy, reverting a river to trap Khitan force-seasoned, won a decisive victory, pushing the invaders back. The Khitan, though mighty, could not conquer the peninsula, and so a tense balance emerged. But as centuries rolled forward, new northern powers arose. The Jurchens, ancestors of the later Manchu, grew strong in Manchuria. Skilled horsemen and hunters, they challenged Goryeo's northern defenses. At times, they were allies, at times raiders. Goryeo kings, seeking peace, built walls along the northern frontier, long earthen ramparts and wooden palisades, some of which still trace the landscapes of today's North Korea. These walls, stretching across mountains and rivers, were not unlike the Great Wall of China, though smaller, meant to guard farms and villages from sudden raids. Despite wars, trade and cultural exchange never ceased. Northern tribes provided furs, horses, and hawks, prized in Goryeo courts. In return, Korean artisans sent pottery, silk, and books. Among these cultural treasures, Goryeo's artisans perfected Celadon ceramics, jade green pottery of breathtaking beauty, etched with cranes, lotuses, and clouds. Though created in the southern peninsula, such works often found their way north through trade routes, leaving traces of artistry even in borderlands. Religion too shaped the northern lands. Buddhism flourished, with temples rising in mountain valleys. Yet, among the Jurchen and steppe peoples, shamanism remained dominant. The drumbeat of shamans calling to ancestral spirits echoed alongside the chanting of monks. This coexistence painted the North as a frontier of blended faiths, where warriors carried charms of both Buddha and sky gods. By the 12th century, the Jurchen had grown into a formidable power, creating the Jin dynasty that conquered northern China. Goryeo, now squeezed between the mighty Jin to the north and the Song dynasty to the south, navigated survival through diplomacy and tribute. Northern Korea, caught between empires, became a frontier zone, sometimes a battlefield, sometimes a bridge of cultures. Through it all, the North remained distinct, while the southern peninsula grew more agrarian, refined, and tied to Confucian bureaucracy. The North carried the echo of steppe resilience. Its people were frontier folk hunters, fortress dwellers, and survivors of harsh winters. They inherited memories of Goguryeo and Balhae, of walls and fortresses, of battles against empires. These memories would never fully fade, and in later centuries, they would resurface as powerful symbols in the shaping of modern North Korean identity. Imagine now the northern lands under moonlight, the ruins of Balhae cities. Snow drifting over ancient walls, smoke curling from Jurchen camps beyond the rivers. It is quiet, yet alive with spirits of past kingdoms, each leaving their mark upon the soil of the North. The 13th century arrived with a thunder of hoofs. From the steppes of Central Asia rode the Mongols, fierce warriors under Genghis Khan and his successors, their banners whipping in the wind, their arrows blotting out the sun. No kingdom in Asia could ignore their approach, and Goryeo was no exception. The Mongols first appeared on Korea's borders in 1231. Their armies swept into the north, crossing frozen rivers, torching villages, and demanding tribute. The court of Goryeo, desperate to survive, retreated from its capital at Gajong to the island fortress of Ganghwa, surrounded by tidal waters, safer from Mongol cavalry. For decades, war ground on. The north bore the brunt of Mongol fury. Towns in today's North Korean lands, Pyongyang, Kaesong's outskirts, the northern fortresses were invaded repeatedly. People were taken as captives, villages reduced to ash, fields trampled by hooves. Yet resistance endured. Monks, peasants, and soldiers fought from mountain strongholds, prolonging defiance. The Mongols, unaccustomed to Korea's rugged hills and monsoon rains, found the land difficult, but their persistence was relentless. By the mid-13th century, Goryeo was forced into submission. The kingdom became a vassal of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, its kings intermarrying with Mongol princesses, its culture shaped by steppe influence. The northern regions of Korea felt this influence most keenly. Mongol garrisons were stationed in key fortresses, and local people were conscripted into Mongol campaigns. Sailing as far as Japan in the ill-fated invasions of 1274 and 1281, many Koreans from the north became soldiers, artisans, or even slaves within the Mongol Empire, scattered across Asia. Yet, cultural exchanges also flowed. The Mongols introduced new technologies, improved horse gear, falconry techniques, even culinary influences like dairy products. Stories tell of Korean artisans taken to Mongolia to build palaces, while Mongol craftsmen left marks on Korean fortresses. The blending of traditions gave the north a frontier character where steppe and peninsula met. Pyongyang, long a historic city, suffered greatly under Mongol domination, but remained important. Its walls, rebuilt and repaired, became symbols of endurance. People whispered legends of Dangan, the mythical founder, as a way of holding onto identity during foreign rule. In these myths, the bear, who became a woman, and the heavenly prince, who fathered the Korean people, stood as reminders that no empire could erase their roots. By the 14th century, the Yuan dynasty weakened and Goryeo began to regain autonomy. Northern Korea saw an opportunity to reassert itself. Local generals fortified the borders once again, and a spirit of independence stirred. Out of this shifting landscape, a new dynasty emerged, the Joseon dynasty. Founded in 1392 by Yi Sung-gai, a general who had risen to prominence defending the northern frontier. Yi Sung-gai was born near the Yalu River. In the lands of today's North Korea, he knew the northern winds, the hardships of border warfare, the constant pressure of jerking tribes and Mongol remnants. When he turned against the old Goryeo regime and founded a new dynasty, he carried with him a northern perspective. Joseon, though centered in the southern peninsula, was born out of northern struggles. The early Joseon dynasty immediately turned its attention to securing the north. Yi Seong-gai, later known as King Taizhou, launched campaigns to pacify the Jurchens along the Yalu and Tumen rivers. Fortresses were built, walls extended, and garrisons placed. Pyongyang was restored as a major regional hub, celebrated for its history, and chosen as one of Joseon's key provincial centers. Under Joseon, the north became both a defensive shield and a cultural frontier. Unlike the fertile rice fields of the south, the northern lands were harsher, with shorter growing seasons. People relied on millet, barley, and hardy grains, hunting and gathering, supplementing agriculture. This gave northern society a rugged resilience, admired and sometimes looked down upon by southern elites, who considered the north wild and distant. It became known as the Western Capital, Sejong, one of the dynasty's auxiliary capitals, alongside Kaesong and Hanyang, modern Seoul. Temples, schools, and Confucian academies were established, while markets bustled with goods flowing along the Taedong River. The city's residents took pride in their heritage, preserving Goguryeo, legends, and Bahai memories, even as the dynasty emphasized Confucian orthodoxy. Confucianism reshaped northern society. Scholars were appointed to administer the provinces, ancestral rites were enforced, and hierarchies deepened. Yet the north remained a place where old beliefs lingered more strongly than in the south. Shamans still beat their drums in village festivals. Women offered food to mountain spirits, and farmers prayed at sacred trees. The state sought to suppress these practices, but in the quiet of valleys and the whisper of forests, ancient traditions endured. The Joseon dynasty also left an extraordinary cultural legacy. King Sejong, in the 15th century, commissioned the invention of Hangul, the Korean alphabet, making literacy accessible to common people. Though centered in Seoul, Hangul spread northward, carried by scholars and officials. Pyongyang became a place where this script took root, taught in schools and temples. For centuries, however, Hangul remained secondary to Chinese characters among elites. And in the north, ordinary villagers often used Hangul more freely than their aristocratic counterparts. Defensively, Joseon maintained vigilance along its northern frontier. The 4 garrisons, Sagan, and 6 garrisons, Yukjin, were established in the 15th century to secure the Tumen and Yalu regions. These fortresses were harsh postings manned by soldiers who braved freezing winters, raids, and isolation. Life in these garrisons was austere, but they symbolized Joseon's commitment to hold the north. Relations with the Jurchens remained complex. At times, Joseon traded with them, exchanging food, cloth, and tools for horses, furs, and hawks. At other times, conflict erupted, with Jurchen raids devastating northern villages. Joseon kings alternated between military campaigns and diplomacy, trying to keep the frontier stable. Many Jurchens even became semi-assimilated into northern Korean society, blurring ethnic lines. In Pyongyang, culture thrived. It became known for its scholars, poets, and musicians. Plays and festivals filled its streets, and the Taedong River was lined with willow trees that shaded fishermen and boatmen. Yet Pyongyang was also a military city, hosting garrisons and serving as a launch point for northern campaigns. Its dual characters, a center of learning and a bulwark of defense, defined its role in Joseon history. As centuries unfolded, the Joseon dynasty's rigid Confucian order deepened. Aristocrats known as Yangban dominated society, while peasants labored under heavy burdens. In the north, where land was less fertile, poverty was more common. Many northern peasants turned to trade, migration, or service in the military. Some became known for their toughness, enduring hardships that southern elites rarely faced. Over time, this contributed to a subtle cultural divide. The South associated with refinement and agriculture, the North with resilience and martial vigor. By the 16th century, Joseon had grown into a stable Confucian state, but storms were brewing beyond its borders. The Jurchens to the north were uniting once again, destined to form the powerful Manchu Qing dynasty. Japan, across the sea, was rising under ambitious warlords. The north, once again, would find itself at the crossroads of empires. Imagine now the Taedong River in Pyongyang at dusk, lanterns flickering on boats, willow branches dipping into the water. Soldiers patrol the walls, scholars recite poems, villagers whisper prayers to mountain gods. The city stands serene, yet the horizon trembles with the weight of future invasions. The 17th century dawned with turbulence. Beyond the Yalu River, the Jurchens, the restless neighbors of Joseon, were uniting under charismatic leaders. From scattered tribes, they formed a rising power that would soon shake all of East Asia. These Jurchens, later known as the Manchus, founded the later Jin state. And by 1636, they would declare the Qing dynasty destined to rule China. For Joseon, the north was once again the frontier where fate would be tested. At first, Joseon maintained alliances with the declining Ming dynasty of China. Korean kings honored the Ming as cultural and political overlords, bound by Confucian loyalty. But this placed Joseon in direct opposition to the Jurchens, who were expanding with unstoppable force. The Manchus launched incursions across the Yalu in 1627. Their armies thundered into Korean territory, sweeping past the fortresses of today's North Korea. Pyongyang's walls once again saw foreign banners. The invasion was brief, more a demonstration of power than total conquest, but it left an indelible mark. Korean villages were pillaged, families displaced, and the message was clear. The Jurchens could not be ignored. Worse was yet to come. In 1636, the Manchus returned in greater numbers. This time, their campaign was decisive. The Hosen court, retreating southward, was besieged in Namhansanxiang fortress. Ultimately, Hosen bowed to Qing authority, severing its ties with the Ming. For many Koreans, especially scholars and officials, this was a humiliation that scarred the national psyche. Yet, it also ensured survival, sparing the country from total destruction. The North remained the contact zone with the Qing. Diplomats and traders crossed the Yalu, exchanging gifts and goods. Horses, ginseng, and furs flowed southward. Silk, medicine, and books arrived from China. Despite political subordination, cultural exchange continued. Pyongyang, as a gateway city, played a central role in these interactions. During the late Joseon era, Pyongyang earned a reputation as one of Korea's most vibrant cities outside Seoul. Travelers marveled at its broad streets and markets. Poets celebrated its beauty, with the Taedong River described as a silver ribbon winding through green hills. Its location, midway between Seoul and the northern frontier, made it a strategic and cultural hub. But life in the northern provinces was not easy. Compared to the fertile southern plains, the land was less generous. Winters were long and bitter, with icy winds sweeping across mountains. Peasants often struggled with hunger, supplementing their diet with roots, wild greens, and fish from rivers. Yet hardship bred resilience. The people of the North gained a reputation for strength, endurance, and independence of spirit. This toughness was reflected in society. Many northern families could not rely solely on farming. Men often worked as hunters, traders, or soldiers. Women, too, played active roles in supporting households, engaging in small-scale trade or craft production. The Confucian hierarchy, so rigid in the South, was sometimes looser in the North, where survival demanded flexibility. Outsiders even describe Northerners as more straightforward, less bound by ceremony, and fiercely loyal to their kin. By the 18th century, Hosan society was transforming. Population growth strained resources, corruption deepened, and regional disparities sharpened. In the North, resentment brewed. Heavy taxes weighed upon poor farmers, while officials, often appointed from southern families, exploited local people. Discontent simmered like embers waiting for a spark. Pyongyang, meanwhile, developed a unique identity. It was sometimes called the Jerusalem of the East for its later association with Christianity. But even before that, it stood out as a city of both tradition and change. Its residents prided themselves on ancient heritage, the legends of Dangan, the ruins of Goguryeo. The memory of Balhabit also embraced new ideas. One of the most remarkable shifts in the late Hosan period was the arrival of Catholicism. Through Chinese books and secret missionaries, Christianity entered Korea in the late 18th century. Pyongyang became one of the centers where these teachings spread. To the ruling elite, Catholicism was dangerous. It undermined Confucian rituals, rejected ancestor worship, and encouraged equality before God. To common people, especially in the North, It offered hope and dignity in a harsh world. The state responded with persecution. Converts were imprisoned, tortured, and executed. Yet the faith persisted, growing quietly in villages and cities. Pyongyang would eventually become home to a thriving Christian community, one that would shape its destiny centuries later. Economically, the North also played a crucial role in the ginseng trade. Wild ginseng, prized in China for its medicinal properties, grew in the mountains of Hamjiang and Pyongan provinces. Traders braved forests and bandits to harvest roots, some worth their weight in silver. This trade brought wealth to certain families, but also attracted corruption, as officials sought to monopolize profits. By the 19th century, Joseon was weakening. Internally, corruption and factionalism eroded governance. Externally, new powers loomed. Western nations with gunboats, Japan with modernizing ambitions, China struggling under foreign pressure. The North, as always, stood at the frontier of change. In Pyongyang, whispers of reform and foreign contact grew louder. Traders brought tales of strange ships and powerful weapons. Intellectuals debated how to preserve Korean identity in a changing world. Yet the dynasty clung to old ways, resisting modernization. The 19th century also saw uprisings fueled by poverty and discontent. One notable rebellion was the Hangzhongnay Rebellion in 1811, centered in the north. Hang, a former government interpreter angered by injustice, rallied peasants, traders, and even disaffected soldiers. His forces briefly captured towns and challenged the state, crying out against corruption and inequality. Though crushed by government troops, the rebellion revealed the depth of northern grievances. The North, poorer and harsher than the South, became associated with resistance and rebellion. Its people, long hardened by frontier life, often stood at the forefront of protest. The government viewed the region with suspicion, both as vital for defense and as a source of unrest. Meanwhile, Pyongyang continued to thrive culturally. Its scholars contributed to the Silhak practical learning movement, which sought realistic reforms in agriculture, economics, and governance. Artists painted its landscapes, writers composed poems about its river and hills, and merchants enriched its markets. The city was both proud of its past and restless for change. As the century drew on, Western powers forced open East Asia. Ships from America, Britain, and France pressed upon Korea's shores, demanding trade and contact. Missionaries sought entry, some secretly reaching Pyongyang. The city's Christian community grew despite persecution, foreshadowing its future as a major religious center. But Hosung clung to isolation. Officials feared that opening to foreigners would erode Confucian order. The dynasty earned the nickname the Hermit Kingdom. In the north, this policy meant continued hardship. While the south saw limited trade with Japan and China, the north remained poor and heavily taxed. By the late 1800s, Korea's sovereignty was in peril. China, weakened by Western incursions, could no longer protect its tributary states. Japan, freshly modernized after the Meiji Restoration, eyed Korea as a stepping stone for expansion. Russia, too, cast its gaze southward, seeking warm water ports. The North, rich in resources and strategically vital, became a focus of these rivalries. Pyongyang stood at the crossroads once again. Its ancient walls, riverside markets, and Confucian schools watched as foreign powers maneuvered for influence. The city, long a center of culture and resilience, braced itself for storms that would soon transform not only the North but the entire Korean peninsula. Imagine Pyongyang in the 19th century. Lanterns glowing on wooden bridges, markets buzzing with traders selling rice, cloth, and ginseng, scholars debating Confucian texts in academies, priests whispering prayers in hidden chapels. Beyond the city walls, soldiers guard the northern frontier, while peasants toil under heavy burdens. The air is thick with history, yet heavy with uncertainty. The world is changing, and the hermit kingdom cannot remain hidden forever. By the mid-19th century, the currents of history surged stronger than ever. Across Asia, the great walls of isolation were crumbling before the force of Western imperialism. Gunboats prowled the seas, missionaries pressed inland, and the balance of power shifted rapidly. Korea, long known as the Hermit Kingdom, could no longer remain hidden. The North, as always, was the first to feel the tremors of change. Pyongyang, with its strategic location along the Taedong River, became a stage where the clash of tradition and modernity would play out. In 1866, an incident shook the city and reverberated far beyond Korea's borders. The French, angered by the execution of Catholic missionaries and converts, launched the French campaign against Korea. Their ships sailed up the Han River toward Seoul. And though they eventually retreated, the episode signaled that Korea was vulnerable to foreign military force. That same year, Pyongyang witnessed one of its most infamous encounters with the West. The General Sherman incident. An American merchant ship, the General Sherman, attempted to open trade by sailing up the Taedong River. Its crew clashed with local officials, tensions escalated, and eventually the vessel was set ablaze by Korean defenders. All aboard perished. For Pyongyang, the event became a symbol of defiance against foreign intrusion. For the United States, it was remembered as a provocation that would later justify military expeditions. The General Sherman affair revealed much about Northern resilience. The people of Pyongyang, armed with little more than fireboats and determination, had repelled a foreign vessel. The city became a legend in Korean memory, proof that even in an age of foreign gunboats, resistance was possible. But resistance came at a cost. Foreign powers grew more determined to pry open Korea. In 1871, the United States launched the Shinmyeongjwa punitive expedition against Korea. American forces attacked Ganghwa Island, burning forts and killing soldiers. Although the expedition did not capture Seoul or Pyongyang, it further eroded Korea's isolation. While Westerners pressed from the sea, Japan advanced from across the East Sea. Having modernized rapidly during the Meiji Restoration, Japan sought colonies and resources. Korea, rich in farmland and minerals, stood as both a prize and a gateway to continental influence. In 1876, after a gunboat threat, Korea signed a Treaty of Ganghwa, opening ports to Japanese trade. The treaty was a turning point. Now, Japan was encroaching with modern power, and Pyongyang, at the heart of the North, became part of the struggle between old loyalties and new realities. Throughout the late 19th century, Pyongyang's Christian community flourished. Missionaries, once hunted, returned openly. Churches were built, schools established, and Western medicine introduced. Pyongyang earned the nickname Jerusalem of the East, a city where faith and learning blossomed. Thousands converted, drawn by promises of equality and dignity. This religious transformation gave the city a distinct identity, unlike any other in Korea. Yet, faith alone could not shield the land from geopolitical storms. The Qing dynasty of China still considered Korea a tributary state, but Japan sought to wrest influence away. Tensions exploded in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. Battles raged across Korea, and Pyongyang became a major battlefield. In September 1894, Japanese and Chinese armies clashed near Pyongyang. The city's ancient walls once again bore witness to bloodshed. Despite Chinese fortifications, Japanese forces, modernized and disciplined, captured Pyongyang after fierce fighting. The victory proved decisive. Within months, Japan defeated China and forced the Treaty of Shimonoseki, ending centuries of Chinese dominance over Korea. For the North, this marked a new era. The Qing were gone, and Japan was now the dominant force. Pyongyang, battered by war, became a symbol of the shift in East Asia's balance of power. The Korean people, however, had little say in their fate. The aftermath brought reforms, but also confusion. Korea declared independence, yet Japanese advisors soon guided its government. Reformers sought to modernize administration, education, and the military. But corruption, resistance from conservative officials, and factional strife weakened progress. In the countryside of the North, discontent boiled over. Heavy taxes, famine, and exploitation sparked uprisings. One of the largest was the Donghuk Peasant Movement, 1894. A grassroots rebellion calling for justice, equality, and the expulsion of foreign powers. Peasants armed with bamboo spears rose against corrupt officials and landlords. Though centered more in the south, the rebellion resonated deeply in the north, where hardship was equally severe. Pyongyang, meanwhile, continued to attract foreign interest. American missionaries established institutions like schools and hospitals, shaping a generation of Koreans who would later become leaders. The city grew into a vibrant hub of trade and religion, yet under the shadow of imperial rivalry. As the 20th century approached, another great power entered the struggle for Korea, Russia, seeking warm water ports and influence in Manchuria. Russia extended its hand over northern Korea. Railways were planned, mines explored, and troops stationed. Pyongyang once again found itself on the front lines of global power struggles. Japan and Russia soon collided in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905. Fierce battles unfolded across Manchuria and Korea. Although Pyongyang was not the central battlefield this time, its roads and rivers carried soldiers, supplies, and news. The war ended with a stunning Japanese victory shocking the world. For it was the first time an Asian power had defeated a European empire in modern warfare. The outcome sealed Korea's fate. Japan tightened its grip, and by 1910, Korea was formally annexed, entering the dark era of colonial rule. For Pyongyang, this meant profound change. Japanese officials occupied government buildings, industries were reorganized, and resistance was suppressed. The city, that had once repelled gunboats and nurtured faith, now lived under foreign domination. Yet, even in these times, the spirit of resistance remained. Northern Koreans, long hardened by frontier struggles, would play a major role in independence movements. Secret societies met in villages, students whispered revolutionary ideas, and Christian churches became centers of both faith and nationalism. The late 19th century had transformed Pyongyang from a proud Confucian city into a contested space of empire, religion, and resistance. Its people had endured invasion, rebellion, and war, yet maintained their resilience. The Taedong River still flowed through its heart, carrying with it the echoes of Goguryeo kings, Ming envoys, Manchu armies, and now the footsteps of Japanese colonizers. As the 20th century dawned, the fate of Korea would hinge on the struggles that lay ahead: colonial exploitation, global war, and revolution. And in the north, Pyongyang was destined to remain a crucible where history burned brightest. When the year 1910 arrived, the old kingdom of Korea was dissolved. The flag lowered, the throne abolished, and the peninsula absorbed into the Japanese Empire. From Seoul to the far northern valleys, the transformation was swift and absolute. The age of dynasties was over, and a new, harsher order began. For the north, the occupation carried its own peculiar weight. Its mountains, rivers, and coal-rich valleys drew particular attention from Japanese authorities. Pyongyang, Hamhung, Chongjin, and the mining towns of the borderlands became resource hubs, feeding the empire's hunger for steel, coal, and labor. The north, so long a fortress of defense, was now a quarry for imperial ambition. Japanese officials moved into government compounds, replacing Korean magistrates. Streets were widened, police stations built, and schools reorganized. Yet, beneath this veneer of modernization lay deep oppression. The Korean language was pushed aside in schools. Japanese textbooks dictated lessons, and Shinto shrines were constructed to enforce loyalty to the Emperor of Japan. Even Pyongyang, once Jerusalem of the East, saw its churches surveilled, pastors silenced, and congregations pressured to bow at shrines not their own. Still, the North adapted in unexpected ways. Pyongyang's Christian schools and hospitals continued to function, becoming havens for quiet dissent. In classrooms, students read Japanese lessons by day, but whispered Korean poems by candlelight at night. The church hymns of the Taedong echoed with both devotion and defiance. The exploitation of resources pressed hardest in the mining regions of the north. The Musin iron mines and coalfields of Ketchun and Anju were expanded, worked by long hours of Korean laborers under strict Japanese supervision. The clatter of picks, the hiss of furnaces, and the rumble of railways transformed the rural silence into an industrial rhythm. The Japanese laid down tracks that stitched the North into a supply network, carrying ore and coal to the ports of Wonsan and Chongjin, from where it would fuel the empire's factories and battleships. But this same industrial intrusion created opportunities for resistance. Workers' strikes erupted in the 1920s, their voices carried from mine shafts to city streets. Labor unions, though illegal, formed in secret, spreading ideas of socialism and nationalism. In villages along the Yalu and Tumen rivers, whispers of revolution traveled with the wind, carried by men who crossed into Manchuria and back, seeking new paths to liberation. It was in this crucible of hardship and resistance that one young man began his journey, Kim Song-ru, later known to the world as Kim Il-sung. Born in 1912 in the village of Manjeongdae, near Pyongyang, Kim grew up in a household steeped in both Christianity and anti-Japanese sentiment. His father, a schoolteacher and activist, instilled in him the twin legacies of learning and resistance. When Kim was still a child, his family, like many in the North, fled to Manchuria to escape repression. There, in the rugged borderlands where Korean, Chinese, and Russian influences mingled, the seeds of his revolutionary path took root. By his teenage years, Kim had joined anti-Japanese guerrilla groups operating in Manchuria's forests. These bands of fighters, poorly armed but fiercely determined, became symbols of defiance for Koreans back home. Meanwhile, Pyongyang itself remained a complex city under Japanese rule. Its Christian schools continued to thrive, producing educated young Koreans who dreamed of independence. Many later joined the March 1st movement of 1919, when nationwide demonstrations swept across the peninsula. Pyongyang students filled its streets, waving banners, reciting the Declaration of Independence, and facing down Japanese police. The protests were crushed, yet the spirit of resistance was not extinguished. For the ordinary people of the North, daily life was a paradox. On one hand, Japanese industrialization brought railroads, factories, and electricity. Pyongyang saw the rise of cinemas, department stores, and modern infrastructure. Yet these modernities were not for Koreans' benefit, but for colonial control. Farmers were dispossessed, taxes tightened, and food supplies diverted to feed the empire. Many families lived in poverty, their sons conscripted into forced labor, their daughters sometimes taken as so-called comfort women. Still, the North remained fertile ground for revolutionary thought. The closeness of Manchuria and Siberia exposed its people to ideas of socialism, communism, and anti-imperialism. In the mining camps and railway yards, Marxist pamphlets passed hand to hand. Korean intellectuals debated in hushed voices, was independence to be won by appeals to America and Europe, or through revolution and arms? In the 1930s, as Japan tightened its rule further, guerrilla activity increased. Bands of Koreans, often based across the Yalu in Manchuria, launched raids against Japanese outposts and collaborators. Among them, Kim Il-sung began to distinguish himself as a young commander. Though still in his 20s, his charisma and discipline drew followers. Legends began to form some true, some embellished, that painted him as a bold warrior, ambushing Japanese patrols, striking rail lines, and vanishing into the forests. Pyongyang, though heavily policed, quietly celebrated news of these guerrilla exploits. For the oppressed city, every rumor of resistance was like a spark in the night. The Japanese, however, responded with harsh crackdowns. Families suspected of aiding guerrillas were arrested, churches raided, and villages burned. Yet even this only deepened the resentment that fueled rebellion. The 1930s also brought war on a larger scale. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, creating the puppet state of Manchukuo, and from there launched deeper conquests into China. The borderlands of northern Korea grew tense, filled with soldiers, checkpoints, and watchtowers. Guerrilla fighters like Kim Il-sung were hunted relentlessly, yet their cause gained stature as Japan became the common enemy of Koreans, Chinese, and Russians alike. By the late 1930s, the guerrilla struggle was brutal and unrelenting. Many groups were destroyed, their fighters killed or captured. Kim Il-sung himself narrowly escaped capture multiple times, eventually retreating into Soviet territory with surviving followers. In the Soviet Union, he received military training, organizing Korean units under Soviet command. There, his legend grew further, nurtured by propaganda, and stories spread among exiled Koreans. Back in Pyongyang, life tightened under wartime mobilization. The city's factories roared with activity, churning out supplies for Japan's war machine. Koreans were pressed into service in increasing numbers, sent not only to mines and railways, but to battlefields far from home. As World War II expanded, the North's resources were drained further, its people carrying burdens for a cause not their own. Yet, beneath the surface, change brewed. The war that consumed Asia would eventually weaken Japan, opening a path for Korea's liberation. And in the mountains, fields, and foreign training camps, figures like Kim Il-sung were preparing to seize the moment. Thus, in the decades of Japanese colonial rule, the North was transformed, its cities modernized yet oppressed, its people broken yet unyielding. Out of this crucible came both suffering and strength, and within its shadows, the man who would later define the destiny of North Korea first sharpened his resolve. The river Taedong still flowed, quiet and steady as it had for centuries. But its waters now carried the reflections of factories and barracks, rail bridges and watchtowers, all symbols of a land caught between foreign domination and the dream of freedom. By the early 1940s, the Japanese Empire stood at the height of its power. Its banners flew from the mountains of Korea to the islands of the Pacific, from the heart of Manchuria to the gates of Southeast Asia. Yet behind this facade of strength, strain was beginning to show. The war consumed men and resources at an impossible pace. For the Koreans of the North, this meant even harsher exploitation. Factories in Pyongyang, Hungnam, and Cheongjin labored without pause, their chimneys filling the sky with smoke. Coal trains rumbled day and night, carrying fuel to feed the war machine. Food was requisitioned, leaving markets bare and families hungry. Young Korean men were conscripted into labor battalions, building fortifications, or sent across the sea to toil in Japan's industries. Others were drafted into the Japanese army, pressed to fight wars in faraway lands for a cause they did not share. The people endured, but beneath the surface, resentment deepened. Stories of guerrilla fighters still circulated in whispers, even though many groups had been destroyed or driven into exile. Among those in exile was Kim Il-sung, who, by the late 1930s, had retreated into the Soviet Union with surviving comrades. In the Soviet Far East, Kim Il-sung found both refuge and new purpose. He and his men were absorbed into the Soviet military structure, trained, armed, and organized into units composed of Korean exiles. It was here that Kim began to shape his identity not only as a guerrilla, but as a commander. He learned discipline, tactics, and above all, the art of political survival within the structures of a greater power. The Soviets, recognizing his charisma and usefulness, began to groom him as a potential leader for Korea once the war ended. Meanwhile, within Korea itself, life grew ever more desperate as the Pacific War turned against Japan. By 1943 and 1944, Allied bombings struck Japanese cities, and whispers reached Korea that the empire's grip was faltering. In the north, underground cells Christian, activists, nationalists, light, kept the flame of resistance alive, waiting for the moment liberation would come. That moment arrived in the summer of 1945. The tide of war had finally reached Japan's doorstep. In August, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, shattering the Japanese leadership's resolve. At the same time, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, launching a massive offensive across Manchuria. The Red Army swept through Manchuria and northern Korea with overwhelming force. Japanese troops, already demoralized, crumbled before the Soviet advance. Within days, they surrendered or fled, leaving their garrisons and supply depots abandoned. Pyongyang, once a city under strict police control, suddenly found its occupiers gone. The people poured into the streets, tearing down Japanese signs, pulling down Shinto shrines, and raising the old Korean flag once more. It was a moment of exultation after 35 years of colonial rule. Korea was free. But liberation came with division. At the close of the war, the Allies hastily agreed to divide the peninsula into two zones of occupation: the Soviets in the north, the Americans in the south. The dividing line was the 38th parallel, a line chosen with little regard for Korea's own history or unity. What had once been one land would now be split in two. In the north, the Soviets quickly moved to establish control. They dismantled Japanese administrative structures and installed their own military government. Yet they knew that lasting authority required Korean faces at the forefront. It was here that Kim Il-sung re-entered history in force. In October 1945, Kim was presented to the people of Pyongyang at a mass rally. The young man, only 33 years old, stood before the crowd in a Soviet uniform, introduced by Soviet officers as a national hero, a guerrilla who had fought valiantly against the Japanese. For many in the crowd, his name was unfamiliar, but his image was powerful. a Korean son returned from exile. Backed by the victorious Red Army, the Soviets cultivated Kim carefully, promoting him as a symbol of resistance and future leadership. Other Korean leaders existed: nationalists, communists, Christians, and moderates, but Kim had two advantages. First, he was aligned with the Soviets, who controlled the North militarily. Second, his guerrilla past gave him an aura of authenticity. A man of action who had not merely written pamphlets but taken up arms. Over the next few years, the structures of the future Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, began to take shape. Land reform was among the first and most dramatic changes. Vast estates, owned by Japanese officials and Korean landlords, were confiscated and redistributed to peasants. This not only dismantled old power structures, but won Kim and the Communists wide support among the rural population. Industry, too, was reorganized. Factories, once run for Japanese benefit, were nationalized, their output redirected to rebuilding the war-torn economy. The Soviets provided technical advisors, equipment, and ideological guidance. Pyongyang transformed into a political center. Its streets, adorned with red banners, its schools teaching Marxist-Leninist ideas alongside Korean patriotism. Politically, Kim Il-sung maneuvered with skill. Rival factions existed: communists who had operated in China, nationalists with deep roots in Pyongyang, Christian leaders with influence among the people. But with Soviet backing, Kim gradually outmaneuvered or absorbed them. Through purges, alliances, and the careful use of propaganda, he emerged as the undisputed leader of the North. For the people, the late 1940s were years of transition. After decades of colonial humiliation, there was pride in reclaiming land, factories, and self-rule. Yet, there was also unease. Soviet soldiers remained in the streets, and political life grew narrower as dissent was stifled. The dream of independence was real, but it came tethered to the shadow of a greater power. Still, Kim Il-sung's popularity grew. His image was cultivated carefully. A man of the people, a fatherly figure who visited villages, who listened to workers and farmers, who embodied the dream of a free Korea. Songs were written in his honor. Newspapers filled with his speeches, and portraits hung in classrooms and offices. The seeds of a personality cult, small at first, began to take root. Meanwhile, across the 38th parallel, a different story unfolded. In the South, under American occupation, leaders with different visions of Korea's future were rising. Among them was Syngman Rhee, an older statesman with strong ties to the United States, who favored a staunchly anti-communist government. Thus, from the very beginning, the peninsula's two halves were moving on divergent paths: one American-backed, one American-backed. By 1948, this divergence became official. The Republic of Korea ROC was declared, with Syngman Rhee as its first president. In response, in September of that year, the North proclaimed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, with Kim Il-sung as premier. For the first time, the words North Korea and South Korea were not just geographical descriptions, but political realities. One people, one culture, now divided by ideology and foreign powers. The seeds of future conflict were sown. And in Pyongyang, the portrait of Kim Il-sung was raised higher, his voice broadcast farther, his image solidified as the father of the new nation. The boy from Manjiangdae, once a guerrilla in the forests of Manchuria, now stood as the leader of a state. The liberation from Japan had brought freedom, but not unity. The dream of a single, independent Korea remained unfulfilled, and soon that dream would collide with war. The year was 1950. Across the divided land of Korea, tension crackled like a storm before lightning. Both North and South proclaimed themselves the sole legitimate government of the Korean people. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung, premier of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, declared that reunification must come under his banner. In Seoul, Syngman Rhee, president of the Republic of Korea, proclaimed the same. Neither side would yield. The border along the 38th parallel was a line on a map. But on the ground, it was a frontier bristling with skirmishes. Patrols clashed in the hills. Shots rang out across rivers and rice paddies. Families, divided by the line, longed to cross. But soldiers with rifles blocked the way. In both capitals, leaders prepared for more than words. Kim Il-sung, convinced that history favored him, pressed his Soviet patrons for permission to strike. He argued that the South was weak, that the people there would welcome liberation, that a swift war could reunite the nation before America could intervene. For months, he petitioned, and at last, with Joseph Stalin's cautious approval and Mao Zedong's blessing, he received the green light. On the dawn of June 25, 1950, the silence along the 38th parallel shattered. North Korean artillery thundered, tanks roared southward, and waves of infantry surged across the border. The Korean War had begun. In Seoul, panic swept the streets as news spread of the invasion. North Korean troops advanced with startling speed, spearheaded by Soviet-built T-34 tanks. South Korean forces, poorly equipped and unprepared, fell back in disorder. Within 3 days, the capital Seoul fell, its bridges dynamited in a desperate attempt to slow the northern advance. Refugees clogged the roads, carrying bundles of clothing. Children clinging to their hands as the red banners of the DPRK unfurled over government buildings. The northern soldiers pressed on relentlessly. By August, they had driven the Southern Army and its American allies into a small pocket around the port city of Busan. It seemed the peninsula might soon be unified under Pyongyang's rule, but the world had taken notice. The United Nations, led by the United States, condemned the invasion. Under a hastily assembled UN command, American, British, Australian, and other Allied troops poured into Korea to support the South. Supplies, ships, and planes surged across the Pacific. What had begun as a Korean civil war was now becoming a global conflict, one front of the broader Cold War. In September, General Douglas MacArthur launched a daring counterstroke. Allied ships landed at Incheon, a port near Seoul, in a bold amphibious assault. The sudden strike cut off North Korean supply lines and sent their forces reeling. Seoul was recaptured, and within weeks, UN forces surged northward, chasing the retreating DPRK troops past the 38th parallel and toward the Yalu River, the border with China. In Pyongyang, the triumph of June had turned to despair. Kim Il-sung's armies collapsed under the pressure of superior firepower. His government fled northward as American bombers pounded cities, bridges, and railways. For a moment, it seemed as though North Korea itself might be erased, absorbed into a southern-led state under UN protection. But history took another turn. In Beijing, the leaders of the newly established People's Republic of China watched the advance with alarm. The thought of hostile armies pressing against their border was intolerable. Mao Zedong ordered the Chinese People's Volunteers into action. In October 1950, under cover of night, waves of Chinese troops crossed the Yalu. At first, UN commanders dismissed reports of their presence. But soon, the truth could not be ignored. In November, the Chinese struck with ferocious force. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers swarmed through the mountains, encircling and overwhelming UN units. The cold Korean winter bit deep, but the tide of war had shifted again. The UN forces retreated south in disorder. Seoul changed hands once more, captured by Chinese and North Korean troops in early 1951. Refugees once again streamed through snow-covered roads, caught between armies. The war had become a pendulum, swinging back and forth across the peninsula. By mid-1951, the front stabilized near the 38th parallel, close to where it had all begun. Trench lines snaked across hills, artillery duels thundered, and soldiers endured months of stalemate in mud and cold. Villages lay in ruins, fields untended, cities shattered by bombing. The land itself seemed to groan under the weight of suffering. Negotiations for peace began, but dragged on bitterly for 2 long years. Both sides sought advantage at the table and on the battlefield. Prisoners of war, displaced families, and civilians caught in between bore the heaviest burdens. Last, on July 27, 1953, the guns fell silent. An armistice was signed at Panmunjom, freezing the front along a line close to the original 38th parallel. The agreement created the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, a strip of land bristling with barbed wire and watchtowers, separating north and south. The war had not united Korea. Instead, it had deepened the division. Over 3 million lives were lost, cities lay in ruins, and families remained divided. The wounds of the war cut deep into the nation's heart. In Pyongyang, however, the narrative was different. Though his initial gamble had nearly destroyed the North, Kim Il-sung emerged as the unquestioned leader. He portrayed the war as a victory proof that tiny Korea, under his leadership, had withstood the might of the United States and its allies. His image grew ever larger. Savior of the nation, father of the people, defender of independence. The cult of personality deepened. Portraits of Kim hung in every school, every factory, every office. His speeches were memorized, his deeds sung in ballads. Children learned to trace his name before they learned arithmetic. To question his leadership was unthinkable. Yet, beneath the propaganda lay stark reality. North Korea was devastated. Cities like Pyongyang and Wonsan lay in rubble. Railroads, factories, and farms were shattered. Millions were homeless, hungry, and grieving. But reconstruction began swiftly with aid from the Soviet Union and China. Roads were repaired, housing blocks rose, and industry revived. The war had cemented the division of Korea, a division that would last not for years, but decades. The dream of reunification remained alive, but for the people on both sides of the DMZ. Life would unfold under two very different banners, one under capitalism and American protection, the other under communism and Kim Il-sung's iron rule. And in the North, a new era dawned. The post-war reconstruction and the building of a socialist state. Guided by Kim's vision and sustained by loyalty, demanded through fear, pride, and relentless propaganda. The fires of war had forged the identity of the DPRK, and the world now looked upon a peninsula divided one half looking southward, the other northward, both yearning for unity, yet bound by the scars of conflict. The guns had fallen silent, but the land was scarred beyond measure. The Korean War had left the North a landscape of ashes, factories gutted, villages burned, farmland cratered by shells and bombs. Nearly every bridge had been destroyed, every railway torn apart. Families lived in makeshift shelters or cellars of collapsed buildings. Hunger gnawed, and the grief of millions hung heavy in the air. Yet in Pyongyang, amid the ruins, a new determination took root. Kim Il-sung declared that the destruction was not the end, but a beginning. Standing before crowds in 1953, he promised that North Korea would rise again, not only to recover, but to surpass what had been lost. The war, he insisted, had proven the resilience of his people and the weakness of foreign enemies. The task now was to build a society that could never again be threatened, one entirely self-reliant, unified under his leadership. Reconstruction began at a staggering pace. Soviet and Chinese aid poured in: engineers, machines, blueprints for factories, and entire trainloads of materials. But the official story in North Korea spoke not of foreign generosity, but of Korean ingenuity and Kim's vision. Pyongyang was rebuilt with wide boulevards, imposing government buildings, and monuments celebrating the fatherly leader. By the late 1950s, the capital had transformed into a showcase city, orderly, modern in design, lined with apartment blocks painted in pale pastels. Statues rose in public squares, including a bronze image of Kim Il-sung himself, his gaze fixed forward. Even in reconstruction, the cult of personality grew taller than concrete. Industry was the foundation of recovery. Steel mills roared back to life, coal mines dug deeper, hydroelectric dams spanned rivers. Soviet-style 5-year plans set ambitious targets, and workers were urged to meet or exceed them through campaigns of heroic labor. Songs blared from loudspeakers, praising miners who broke records, farmers who tilled beyond quotas, soldiers who built railroads with bare hands. In the countryside, collectivization reshaped farming. Land was taken from individuals and organized into collective farms, each responsible for meeting state-set quotas. Farmers worked side by side, their output measured not by family needs, but by the demands of the plan. Though life was hard, many were proud of the transformation, believing they were helping to build a truly independent Korea. Yet, Kim Il-sung's ambitions stretched beyond rebuilding. He sought not only to restore his country, but to define its ideology, a guiding principle that would separate North Korea from both Soviet Marxism and Chinese communism, and place him firmly at the center. Out of this vision came Jukki. The word Jukki, often translated as self-reliance, had earlier meanings in Korean thought, but under Kim, it became a political doctrine. First articulated in the mid-1950s, Jukki proclaimed that the Korean people must be the masters of their own destiny, relying neither on Moscow nor Beijing. Though North Korea still accepted aid, the ideology framed every success as the product of Kim's wisdom and the people's unity. In 1955, Kim gave a defining speech. The Jukki idea means, in a word. But in practice, it meant that he himself was the master, the interpreter of Jukki, the embodiment of independence. His philosophy soon became mandatory reading in schools, workplaces, and the army. To question Jukki was to question Kim. During this era, internal rivals and dissenters were steadily eliminated. Some had been pro-Soviet, others pro-Chinese, but all were accused of factionalism. Through purges, show trials, and quiet disappearances, Kim removed any threat to his authority. By the early 1960s, the once diverse leadership of the Workers' Party had been reduced to loyalists who owed everything to him. The state's control expanded into every facet of life. The Korean Workers' Party directed not only politics, but culture, education, and family routines. In schools, children were taught songs praising Kim Il-sung before learning their alphabets. History lessons recast him as the eternal hero of Korea, whose guerrilla exploits had single-handedly driven out the Japanese and whose genius had preserved the nation through the war. Art, literature, and theater were all pressed into service of propaganda. Plays depicted brave workers who overcame hardship through loyalty to Kim. Novels told of peasants who achieved greatness only after realizing their devotion to the party. Painters filled canvases with idealized images of farmers, soldiers, and, above all, the great leader himself, radiant, smiling, eternal. Even the family home was not beyond the reach of ideology. Portraits of Kim Il-sung were distributed and had to be displayed prominently, kept clean and polished. Inspectors visited households to ensure compliance. Loyalty was no longer just political, it was personal, woven into the fabric of daily life. Economically, the 1950s and early 1960s were years of real progress. Heavy industry expanded rapidly. Compared with the South, still struggling with political turmoil and fewer resources, the North seemed to be racing ahead. Visitors from the developing world were brought to Pyongyang, where they saw gleaming factories and modern housing. Presented as proof that socialism under Kim Il-sung was a model for all nations. But beneath the surface, strains were already appearing. The drive for self-reliance clashed with the reality of dependence on Soviet and Chinese aid. Collectivized agriculture increased yields at first, but inefficiencies lingered. And the enormous emphasis on heavy industry often left consumer goods, scarce shoes, clothing, even basic foods were rationed. Still, the image of success was carefully maintained, and few dared question it. By the mid-1960s, the cult of Kim Il-sung had reached new heights. His birthday was celebrated as a national holiday. Poems likened him to the sun, eternal and radiant. Schoolchildren bowed before his portraits. Newspapers filled front pages with his speeches, even on mundane topics like weather or grain harvests. The idea of Korea and the idea of Kim were becoming indistinguishable. This fusion of leader and nation was reinforced by another factor: the continued division of Korea across the DMZ. Barbed wire and guard posts stood as reminders of an unfinished war. The South, with American troops stationed on its soil, was portrayed as a land of oppression, where peasants supposedly cried out for liberation. The North's survival and reconstruction were cast as proof of Kim's greatness, while the South's struggles were used to highlight his superiority. And yet, Kim Il-sung did not merely rely on ideology. He also pursued a military buildup, ensuring that the DPRK would never again be so vulnerable. The Korean People's Army expanded in numbers and in political importance. Military parades through Pyongyang became rituals of strength, tanks and artillery rolling past cheering crowds as jets streaked overhead. All the while, Jukki was emphasized not only as political doctrine, but as a way of life. Farmers were told they could grow food without outside help. Workers that they could outproduce foreign rivals. Intellectuals that their ideas must spring from Korean soil alone. In practice, this often meant isolation and hardship, but within the system. It was presented as noble sacrifice, proof of loyalty. By the end of the 1960s, North Korea had been remade. The ashes of war were replaced by a state that was at once rebuilt and reshaped. Glowing with propaganda, armored with ideology, and guided by a leader whose power had grown absolute. The foundation had been laid for decades of rule. A society organized around Jukki, sealed from outside influence, and defined by the image of one man. The decades after the Korean War had left North Korea battered but resilient. And by the 1970s, the country seemed to stand at its height of strength. Two outsiders, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, appeared, disciplined, industrious, and united under the vision of Kim Il-sung. Factories rumbled with heavy machinery, producing steel, chemicals, and textiles. High-rise apartments, though simple, dotted Pyongyang's skyline. Roads stretched across the countryside, lined with slogans painted on billboards. Long live the great leader, and let us build a self-reliant nation. The state's central planning emphasized heavy industry and defense, ensuring that tanks rolled off production lines and soldiers trained with modern weapons. In comparison, South Korea in the early 1970s was still struggling with dictatorship, poverty, and political unrest. For a moment, it seemed possible that the North had the upper hand. Many countries in the developing world look to Pyongyang as a model of socialist modernization. Delegations arrived from Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, often greeted with choreographed parades of flowers, banners, and smiling citizens. North Korea's diplomats were active abroad. The government offered construction projects, military training, and even free education for foreign students. Embassies opened in dozens of countries. Pyongyang's leaders presented their nation as the true Korea, pure and independent, in contrast to the South's reliance on the United States. For many, it was persuasive North Korea won recognition from more countries than South Korea during the 1970s. At home, the ideology of Jukki deepened its roots. In speeches, Kim Il-sung spoke of building socialism in our own way, rejecting both Moscow and Beijing as flawed models. Citizens were told that every accomplishment, every factory built, every field harvested was proof of the power of self-reliance. Schoolchildren studied Kim's works as sacred texts, reciting his quotes with the reverence of scripture. This was also the period when the cult of personality reached new heights. Kim Il-sung's portraits hung in every home. His statues multiplied across every city and village. His speeches were broadcast endlessly, and his writings compiled into thick volumes. His birthday became the nation's greatest holiday, marked with fireworks, mass dances, and offerings of flowers at his statues. But Kim was already thinking ahead. He was not eternal, though propaganda insisted otherwise. Who would carry his revolution forward? The answer, quietly at first, was his son, Kim Jong-il. Born in 1941, officially 1942, on the sacred Mount Paektu. According to state legend, Kim Jong-il grew up within the revolution's mythology. By the 1970s, he was being groomed for leadership. He rose through the ranks of the party, initially in cultural departments. His focus was on art, film, and propaganda fields that shaped the soul of the people. He oversaw movies glorifying guerrilla fighters and theatrical productions extolling loyalty to the great leader. In these years, North Korea developed its propaganda machine into a polished instrument. Newspapers, films, and music all carried the same message: devotion to Kim Il-sung, readiness to sacrifice, and faith in Jukki. Kim Jong-il became known as the party's center, though the title was rarely spoken publicly. His hand guided the creation of revolutionary operas and cinematic epics. While his father shaped politics and economics, he crafted the myth of eternal revolution. The military, too, remained central. Though the war had ended in 1953, North Korea never ceased to prepare for its return. The demilitarized zone, DMZ, bristled with barbed wire and watchtowers. Soldiers staring across minefields at their southern counterparts. Underground tunnels dug beneath the border were discovered by South Korea in the 1970s, evidence of plans to infiltrate troops in the event of renewed conflict. The nation's paranoia was also turned inward. Security forces monitored citizens constantly. Neighborhood units were organized, each family watched by its neighbors, all expected to report suspicious behavior. Loyalty to the party was measured not only in words, but in bloodlines. Those whose relatives had collaborated with the Japanese or fled south were marked as suspect. Their opportunities limited for generations. Yet for many ordinary North Koreans, the 1970s and early 1980s were remembered as a time of relative stability. Food was available through rationing. Jobs were guaranteed. Housing provided. There was pride in the sense that their nation, though small, stood tall against great powers. Internationally, the tides began to shift. South Korea, under President Park Geun-hye, launched rapid economic development known as the Miracle on the Han River. By the late 1970s, the South's growth began to outpace the North. Electronics, automobiles, and exports surged, while North Korea remained heavily focused on steel and coal. The competition was no longer only ideological, it was economic. Kim Il-sung responded with grand projects to showcase strength. In Pyongyang, construction began on the Rujong Hotel, a 105-story pyramid meant to be the tallest hotel in the world. Massive stadiums and monuments were built, their scale intended to awe both citizens and visitors. These projects consumed resources, but served the leader's desire to demonstrate that his country was second to none. Behind the grandeur, however, cracks widened. Debt to foreign countries grew as Pyongyang borrowed to finance imports in construction. By the 1980s, many lenders stopped extending credit, frustrated by non-payment. Isolation deepened, even as propaganda proclaimed independence. Still, succession plans moved forward. By the mid-1980s, Kim Jong-il was increasingly visible, appearing beside his father at rallies and inspections. His reputation as a brilliant theoretician was spread by the media. Books and pamphlets praised his insight into film, art, and politics. Citizens were encouraged to see him as the natural heir. In 1980, at the Sixth Party Congress, Kim Jong-il's status was revealed openly. He was introduced as the future leader. His image soon joined his father's in homes and schools. North Korea was becoming not merely a one-man dictatorship, but a dynastic system. For Kim Il-sung, this was the culmination of decades of rule. He had built a nation from the ruins of war, imposed an ideology that placed him at its heart, and ensured that his bloodline would continue the revolution. For Kim Jong-il, it was the beginning of his ascent, one that would later reshape the country in darker ways. By the late 1980s, the world was changing. The Soviet Union weakened, China reformed its economy, and South Korea prepared to host the 1988 Olympics, dazzling the world with its prosperity. In Pyongyang, there was pride, but also unease. The external pillars that had long supported North Korea were shifting. Yet, inside the country, few were aware of a coming storm. For the people of North Korea, the 1970s and 80s would be remembered as the high watermark, a time when food was still sufficient. Factories still roared, and the promise of Jukki still felt attainable. The shadows of famine and collapse had not yet fallen. For Kim Il-sung, it was the last act of his long rule before passing the torch to his son. The dynasty was secured. The myth of self-reliance was entrenched, and the path forward, though uncertain, was already written. North Korea would follow the Kim family, whatever the cost. The dawn of the 1990s brought a shudder through the foundations of the North Korean state. For decades, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea had balanced precariously between its two great allies, the Soviet Union and China. Both had offered trade, fuel, and political cover. But as the Cold War crumbled, so too did these supports. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. Its successor states had little interest in subsidizing Pyongyang's needs. Oil shipments, once delivered at favorable rates, dried up. Trade collapsed almost overnight. Machinery that had relied on imported spare parts ground to a halt. Factories stood idle, their smokestacks cold. At the same time, China was changing rapidly under Deng Xiaoping's reforms. Market forces, foreign investment, and private business were transforming the Chinese economy. Beijing no longer offered aid with the same generosity, urging instead that North Korea reform its own economy. But Kim Il-sung and his son Kim Jong-il resisted. To embrace markets, they feared, was to risk ideological collapse. Thus, North Korea turned inward, just as its lifelines were cut. The consequences were devastating. By the early 1990s, food shortages became severe. For decades, the state had promised rations for all: rice, corn, oil, and meat. Citizens lined up at distribution centers, confident that the party would provide. Now, warehouses were empty. Trucks did not arrive. The public distribution system, long a pillar of North Korean life, faltered and then broke. Farmers struggled as well. Fertilizer, fuel, and modern machinery had all depended on imports. Without them, harvests plummeted. Yields dropped to a fraction of their former levels. Floods in 1995 and 1996, followed by droughts, destroyed what little was left. The state called this time the Arduous March, invoking memories of the guerrilla struggle against Japan. But for ordinary people, it was not heroic. It was hunger, fear, and death. By some estimates, hundreds of thousands. Over 2 million people perished in the famine of the 1990s. Villages emptied. Children with hollow eyes and swollen bellies wandered roadsides. Families boiled grass, bark, and corn husks into thin soup. Stories spread of desperate acts of theft, of abandoned children, of even darker rumors whispered in secret. Through it all, propaganda insisted that the hardships were temporary, that the people's endurance would prove their loyalty. But many began to lose faith. For the first time in decades, the state's iron grip weakened, not through rebellion, but through necessity. People turned to survival outside the system. Black markets called Jangmadang sprang up. At first illegal, they became lifelines, selling food smuggled from China, homegrown vegetables, even small goods like soap or cloth. Women, often the backbone of families, became traders, crossing rivers into China or bartering in hidden corners of towns. These markets would grow into a permanent feature of North Korean life, a parallel economy born from desperation. Meanwhile, the leadership changed. In 1994, Kim Il-sung, the eternal leader, died. His funeral was immense, filled with weeping crowds, soldiers saluting, and processions of flowers. For nearly half a century, he had ruled as the face of the nation. Now, the mantle passed to his son, Kim Jong-il. For the people, his rise brought uncertainty. He had long been present in propaganda, but had never held the same aura as his father. Some whispered doubts. Could he truly lead? Did he have the wisdom of the great leader? Kim Jong-il moved cautiously at first, emphasizing continuity. He declared his father the eternal president of North Korea, ensuring that his own rule would be as a caretaker of the eternal revolution. But gradually, he began to impose his own style of leadership. Unlike his father, Kim Jong-il rarely appeared in public speeches. Instead, he preferred secrecy, ruling from behind closed doors, surrounded by a tight circle of loyal aides. His focus shifted from heavy industry to the military. The policy of Sangun military first was declared. Soldiers would be fed before civilians, weapons built before factories repaired. The logic was brutal but clear. Survival of the regime depended on military strength. North Korea could no longer match the world in economic terms, but it could demand respect through its army. This period also saw the acceleration of another programmed nuclear weapons. For years, North Korea had pursued research quietly, building reactors and enriching materials. But in the 1990s, as its weakness became apparent, it sought to leverage this capability. Negotiations with the United States produced the 1994 Agreed Framework, in which North Korea promised to freeze its nuclear program in exchange for aid, fuel, and the promise of civilian reactors. For a time, it seemed a fragile peace might hold, yet trust was scarce. Both sides accused each other of failing to honor commitments. Progress slowed. Behind the scenes, North Korea continued to hedge its bets, keeping its nuclear ambitions alive. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens endured the famine. Trains stopped running, their engines without fuel. Hospitals had no medicine, electricity cut out for hours or days. Entire regions were left in darkness. The government organized mass campaigns urging loyalty, but people learned to rely on themselves, their families, and the markets that grew like hidden veins across the country. International aid organizations began arriving, bringing food, medicine, and relief supplies. For the first time, outsiders glimpsed the suffering within North Korea. Images of malnourished children, of barren fields, of skeletal families shocked the world. The regime allowed aid, reluctantly, fearing outside influence, but unable to ignore the catastrophe. Kim Jong-il used the crisis to further concentrate power. Those who showed disloyalty were purged. The military's privileges expanded, ensuring their loyalty. State security watched carefully for any sign of dissent, though true rebellion never came. The people were too exhausted, too hungry. By the late 1990s, the worst of the famine had passed. Harvests improved slightly, foreign aid provided relief, and the Jangmadang markets became established. Yet, the scars remained. A whole generation had grown up in hunger, shaped not by the promises of Jackie, but by the reality of survival through trade and smuggling. For the regime, it was both a crisis and a lesson. Kim Jong-il had seen how close the state had come to collapse. He had also seen the power of nuclear weapons as leverage, the loyalty of the military as insurance, and the persistence of markets as unavoidable. North Korea entered the 2000s, battered but unbroken. It had lost, perhaps, a tenth of its people, much of its infrastructure, and the faith of many citizens. But the dynasty endured. The system bent, but not shattered. For the outside world, North Korea was now a pariah, a symbol of isolation and suffering. For its people, life had become a delicate balance of obedience and quiet defiance, of survival through unofficial means. And for Kim Jong-il, it was proof that even through famine, collapse, and despair, the regime could survive so long as the military stood firm, and the leader's authority remained unquestioned. The 1990s had begun with collapse and ended with fragile survival. Ahead lay new challenges: nuclear confrontations, international sanctions, and the slow emergence of a generation raised not in prosperity, but in hardship. The new millennium dawned over a weary North Korea. The famine of the 1990s had scarred the land and its people. But the state had endured. Kim Jong-il, now firmly in control, faced a delicate task: how to secure his regime in a world that had moved on without him. South Korea was thriving. Its glittering cities, advanced technology, and global culture stood in stark contrast to the darkness and silence across the border. China was booming, lifting millions from poverty and rising as a global power. Even Vietnam, once devastated by war, had embraced reforms and prospered. North Korea remained an isolated relic, a frozen state clinging to ideology. But Kim Jong-il understood the logic of survival. His father had wielded ideology and charisma. He would wield something else: the nuclear card. In 2002, U.S. officials accused North Korea of secretly pursuing uranium enrichment. Violating the 1994 agreed framework, relations soured, aid shipments slowed. Once more, tension rose. North Korea expelled international inspectors, restarted its nuclear facilities, and declared its intention to develop weapons openly. In 2003, Pyongyang withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the first country ever to do so. It was a bold signal. North Korea would no longer play by the world's rules. That same year, the six-party talks began. China, Russia, Japan, South Korea, the United States, and North Korea gathered to seek a solution. The meetings stretched over years, a cycle of promises and breakdowns, deals and betrayals. North Korea often agreed to concessions, only to demand more aid or accuse others of hostility. The talks became less about solving the crisis and more about managing it. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-il strengthened his grip on power at home. He doubled down on the Songun policy: military first. Soldiers received rations and fuel before civilians. The army became not only a fighting force, but also a workforce, repairing roads, farming land, even running factories. To the outside world, North Korea projected defiance. In 2006, it conducted its first nuclear test. Though small in scale, it shocked the globe. The United Nations condemned the act, sanctions followed, and yet Kim Jong-il celebrated. North Korea had entered the nuclear club. For the regime, nuclear weapons were not just about defense, they were survival. With them, the state could deter invasion, extract concessions, and demand recognition. Without them, North Korea risked becoming another Iraq, another Libya. Kim Jong-il had seen what happened to leaders who surrendered their weapons. He would not repeat their mistakes. But even as he built his nuclear arsenal, Kim Jong-il played a careful balancing act. He allowed limited cultural exchanges with South Korea, even moments of reconciliation. The 2000 Inter-Korean Summit, where Kim Jong-il met South Korean President Kim Dae-jung in Pyongyang, was historic. Images of the two leaders shaking hands brought hope to many Koreans. Families, long separated, were briefly reunited. Projects like the Kaesong Industrial Complex, where South Korean companies employed North Korean workers, symbolized cautious cooperation. Yet these gestures never went too far. For every step forward, there was a step back. Missile tests, border skirmishes, threats, and propaganda. Kim Jong-il understood that too much openness risked undermining his control. He would give just enough to secure aid and reduce pressure, then pull back into isolation. Inside North Korea, daily life remained harsh. Electricity was unreliable, food scarce, and travel tightly controlled. By the 2000s, they were no longer merely survival tools. They were reshaping society. Women became central figures in this new economy, trading across borders, running stalls, and smuggling goods. Foreign items, Chinese, snacks, DVDs, radios, filtered in. People saw glimpses of another world. South Korean dramas, smuggled on discs or USB drives, showed a life of wealth and freedom. These were dangerous images, undermining state propaganda. But despite harsh crackdowns, the flow could not be stopped entirely. The regime responded with both repression and adaptation. Punishments for illegal media were severe. Yet, some officials quietly tolerated the markets, even profited from them. Corruption spread, greasing the machinery of survival. For the first time, the official system was no longer the only path to life. A shadow society thrived beneath the rigid order of Juki. Kim Jong-il himself cultivated an image both mysterious and eccentric. Rumors swirled that he traveled with a private train stocked with gourmet food and wine, that he loved cinema and had a vast collection of foreign films, that he wore platform shoes to appear taller. To some, these stories seemed absurd, yet they added to his aura. Even in secrecy, he commanded attention. As the decade advanced, North Korea continued to test missiles, defying international warnings. In 2009, it conducted its second nuclear test, more powerful than the first. Sanctions tightened further, but the pattern repeated. Defiance, negotiations, partial agreements, collapse. The world learned that North Korea would not give up its weapons, no matter the cost. At the same time, Kim Jong-il's health began to falter. Reports of strokes and illness emerged. The question of succession grew urgent. Just as his father had prepared him, Kim Jong-il now prepared his own son, Kim Jong-un. Little was known of the young man at first. Educated partly in Switzerland, fond of basketball, he appeared suddenly in state media in the late 2000s, groomed to inherit power. The machinery of cult building began again. Songs, posters, stories of his brilliance. The dynasty was preparing its third generation. By the end of the 2000s, North Korea stood at a crossroads. It was impoverished, isolated, and heavily sanctioned. Its people lived with hardship, relying on markets and smuggling as much as on the state. Yet its regime had survived where others had fallen. Nuclear weapons had given it leverage. The military kept order. The dynasty prepared for another transfer of power. To the outside world, North Korea seemed both fragile and unyielding, a puzzle of suffering and strength, collapse and defiance. To its people, life was a daily negotiation between obedience and quiet resistance, between fear and the small freedoms found in markets, family, and faith that tomorrow might bring more. And for Kim Jong-il, the decade had proven his rule. He had faced famine, isolation, and pressure from the world's greatest powers. Yet he remained. His state remained. His family's rule remained. The 2000s closed with the image of a weary leader, preparing his son for the throne, while the shadow of nuclear weapons loomed larger than ever. Ahead lay a new era, the rise of Kim Jong-un, the youngest and least known of the dynasty. Who would inherit a fragile yet defiant state in the second decade of the 21st century? The dawn of the 2010s brought an air of uncertainty to North Korea. Kim Jong-il, frail and ailing, could not conceal his health forever. The nation braced for what seemed inevitable. Another passing of power in the dynasty that had now ruled for more than 6 decades. In December 2011, the official announcement came. Kim Jong-il, the dear leader, had died. The nation was thrust into carefully orchestrated mourning. State television showed citizens weeping in the streets, some collapsing in grief, their sobs echoing against the cold winter air. Portraits were draped in black ribbons. The voice of the announcer trembled as she read the news. But the machinery of succession moved quickly. His son, Kim Jong-un, barely in his late 20s, was declared the new leader. His youth shocked many observers. North Korea was a deeply hierarchical society, where respect often came with age. Could someone so young command the loyalty of generals, ministers, and the party elite? Kim Jong-un wasted no time in answering that question. Those who doubted him or who posed potential threats were eliminated. In 2013, his own uncle, Jang Song-sek, long considered the second most powerful man in the country, was arrested, denounced in a show trial, and executed. The speed and brutality of the move stunned the world. It sent a clear message. Kim Jong-un was not a figurehead. He was absolute ruler. Other purges followed. Generals dismissed. Officials shuffled, sometimes disappearing entirely from public view. Rumors spread of executions by anti-aircraft guns, of prison camps filling with those who had fallen out of favor. Whether exaggerated or not, the stories served their purpose. Fear cemented Kim Jong-un's control. Yet, alongside this ruthlessness, he cultivated an image distinct from his father. Where Kim Jong-il had been reclusive, Kim Jong-un was visible. He appeared often in public, smiling, gesturing, giving on-the-spot guidance to factories, farms, and soldiers. His style was modeled after his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, whom many older citizens still remembered with a mix of reverence and nostalgia. The haircut, the mannerisms, even the weight he carried all seemed designed to evoke the founding patriarch. North Korean propaganda embraced this new leader with fervor. Songs were written in his honor, murals painted, stories told of his genius. He was declared a master strategist, a brilliant commander, a caring father to the people. The cult of personality, inherited from his forebears, bloomed anew. But Kim Jong-un also faced the same dilemma as his father: how to ensure survival in a hostile world. His answer was to accelerate the nuclear program. In 2013, North Korea conducted its third nuclear test. The explosion was more powerful than the previous ones, and the message was unmistakable. The program would not slow. Missile launches followed, some short-range, others long-range. The international community condemned, sanctioned, threatened, but Kim pressed on. By 2016, 2 more nuclear tests had been conducted, alongside a flurry of missile trials. North Korean scientists unveiled new designs, claiming progress toward miniaturizing warheads and developing intercontinental ballistic missiles. For the first time, the possibility that North Korea could strike the United States itself seemed within reach. The world took notice. In Washington, Seoul, Tokyo, and Beijing, North Korea was no longer seen as a poor, isolated state, rattling sabers. It was becoming a genuine nuclear power, unpredictable and dangerous. At home, Kim Jong-un balanced his military ambitions with selective modernization. He permitted the markets that Jungmadung to expand further. Where once they had been tolerated grudgingly, now they were tacitly accepted as part of the economy. Small entrepreneurs, mostly women, thrived in trade, smuggling, and commerce. This created a new class of relative affluence, the so-called donju, or masters of money. They built restaurants, shops, and apartment buildings in Pyongyang, giving the capital an air of prosperity unseen in the famine years. But this prosperity was uneven. Outside the capital, many still lived with scarcity, their lives tied to agriculture, state rations, or black market trade. Electricity flickered, food remained uncertain, and surveillance never ceased. The markets brought hope, but also inequality, dividing those who could access wealth from those who could not. Kim Jong-un embraced technology as both tool and weapon. He invested in cyber warfare, training hackers who carried out attacks against banks, companies, and even governments. In 2014, the infamous cyber-ratic against Sony Pictures was linked to North Korea. In retaliation for a satirical film mocking the leader, the event revealed a new front in North Korea's defiance. Not only nuclear weapons, but digital sabotage. His leadership was not without showmanship. In 2017, a year marked by escalating missile tests and fiery rhetoric, Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump traded insults. Trump called him Rocket Man. Kim responded with threats of fire and destruction. The world held its breath as North Korea tested missiles capable of reaching American soil and conducted its most powerful nuclear explosion, yet claiming it was a hydrogen bomb. For a time, war seemed possible. South Koreans rehearsed evacuation drills. U.S. bombers flew near the peninsula. China urged calm. Yet, in 2018, the tone shifted dramatically. Kim Jong-un stepped onto the world stage in a way no North Korean leader had before. He crossed the border into South Korea for a summit with President Moon Jae-in. Images of the two leaders smiling, walking hand in hand across the demilitarized zone stunned audiences worldwide. Later that year, Kim met Donald Trump in Singapore, the first ever meeting between a sitting U.S. president and a North Korean leader. The spectacle was extraordinary. Cameras flashed as Kim and Trump shook hands before the world. Statements of friendship and promises of denuclearization were made. The meetings continued into 2019 in Hanoi and then at the DMZ. For a moment, peace felt possible. But like so many efforts before, the talks collapsed. North Korea demanded relief from sanctions in exchange for partial concessions. The United States demanded complete disarmament. Neither would yield. The handshakes and smiles gave way to silence, then to renewed hostility. By the end of the decade, North Korea's nuclear program remained intact, its arsenal larger than ever. Through it all, Kim Jong-un maintained his grip at home. The purges continued quietly. The cult deepened. The dynasty endured. The people adapted, finding ways to live between loyalty and necessity, between fear and the small freedoms markets offered. The 2010s closed with North Korea more visible than ever. No longer merely a shadowy state of famine and propaganda. It was now a nuclear power, a global actor, still repressive, but undeniably formidable. Kim Jong-un had proven that his youth was no weakness. He had inherited a fragile system and made it endure, not through softness, but through steel. And so, the story of North Korea moved forward into the 2020s. A state both timeless and precarious, led by a young dictator whose face now symbolized its destiny. The 2020s dawned with uncertainty for the entire world. For North Korea, the decade began not with parades or summits, but with silence. The coronavirus pandemic swept across nations, and though Pyongyang denied outbreaks, its actions told the truth. Borders were sealed shut, tighter than ever before. Trade with China lifeline of the economies throwed to a trickle. The already isolated nation became an island unto itself. Foreign diplomats were expelled, aid workers sent away, tourism halted completely. For ordinary North Koreans, hardship deepened. Markets struggled without goods to sell. Shortages of medicine grew severe. Smuggling routes, once reliable, were cut by the pandemic controls. Hunger spread quietly, reminiscent of darker years past. Yet the state presented another story. On television, the regime declared that North Korea had defeated the virus through the wisdom of the party and the leadership of Kim Jong-un. No sickness, no weakness, no weakness, no resilience. Behind closed doors, however, whispers spoke of illness, of strict lockdowns in cities, of families struggling with even less than before. Kim Jong-un himself appeared slimmer in later appearances, fueling speculation about his health. At times, he vanished from the public eye for weeks, sparking rumors of illness, even death. But each time, he re-emerged, smiling, cutting ribbons, guiding officials. The uncertainty only added to the aura of mystery that surrounded him. Despite the pandemic, the missile tests did not cease. In fact, they increased. In 2021 and 2022, North Korea unveiled new designs: hypersonic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and longer-range weapons capable of threatening not just regional neighbors, but faraway targets. The world's focus might have been elsewhere, on pandemics, on great power rivalries, but North Korea remained armed, defiant, and determined. Diplomacy, which had flared so brightly in the late 2010s, flickered out. The summit with the United States had ended without agreement. South Korea, under new leadership, shifted its approach to deterrence. Washington, preoccupied with other crises, offered little beyond sanctions and statements. Beijing and Moscow, facing tensions with the West, grew closer to Pyongyang, providing a measure of support against isolation. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-un adjusted his image once more. Where once he had been the smiling young leader, evoking his grandfather, in the 2020s he became sterner, more militaristic. Military parades grew larger, weapons more numerous. Children in Pyongyang learned songs praising missiles. Soldiers pledged loyalty before images of rockets soaring into the sky. And yet, even amid this show of strength, North Korea faced profound challenges. Its economy, already fragile, suffered under the weight of closed borders. Factories lacked materials, farms lacked fertilizer and fuel. Floods and droughts battered crops. Hunger lingered, silent but persistent. Some families relied on wild plants, others on barter. The Jeongmadang survived, but under strain, their stalls emptier than before. Technology offered both cracks of light and shadows. More North Koreans gained access to smuggled smartphones, USB drives, and foreign media. South Korean dramas, Chinese movies, even snippets of Western culture slipped through the barriers. Young people in secret corners whispered of worlds beyond their own, of music and fashion forbidden by the state. The government fought back, tightening surveillance, punishing those caught with reactionary culture. But the seeds of curiosity had been planted, and they grew quietly in the minds of the young. By mid-decade, the dynasty had endured for 3 generations. Kim Jong-un, still relatively young compared to his predecessors, showed no signs of relinquishing power. His sister, Kim Yo-jong, emerged as a prominent figure, issuing fiery statements, attending key events, and hinting at the line of succession should it be needed. Together, they embodied the resilience of the Kim family's rule, a dynasty that had defied predictions of collapse again and again. North Korea's place in the world remained paradoxical. It was one of the poorest nations on earth, yet possessed weapons of mass destruction. Its people faced shortages of food and medicine, yet its leaders stood beside rockets capable of global reach. It was isolated, censured, sanctioned, yet its very defiance ensured it could not be ignored. In Pyongyang, the skyline continued to rise, with new apartments, monuments, and showcases meant to impress. In the countryside, Time often seemed frozen, villages struggling as they had for decades. And so, as the 2020s continue, North Korea lives at a crossroads of contradictions. It is a nation of silence and spectacle, of poverty and power, of secrecy and survival. The story of its people is one of endurance, shaped by control, fear, and hope that flickers quietly in hidden corners. From the guerrilla struggle of Kim Il-sung to the nuclear brinkmanship of Kim Jong-un, North Korea has traveled a path unlike any other nation. Its history is both tragedy and defiance, its future uncertain but unyielding. As you rest now, imagine the Korean peninsula at night, the south glowing with a sea of lights, the north almost entirely dark, save for a faint glow in Pyongyang. Two nations divided by war and ideology, sharing a common history, yet living in starkly different worlds. The story of North Korea is still unfolding, and as we drift into sleep, we leave it not with an ending, but with a pause and unfinished chapter, waiting to be written by time, by history, and by the people who live it.